Hello and welcome to Supposedly Fun. My name is Greg and I'm here today to do a Friday Reads video where I wrap up the week in reading and talk about any exciting book-related things that have happened during the week. And this has been a very exciting week for books. But if you would prefer to skip to the Friday Reads portion of the video where I talk about the one book that I read and the two books I have ongoing, you can do so with the timestamp that will be in the description box down below. So the first big book news item that happened this week is, of course, the Nobel Prize for Literature announced that Han Kang was the winner. I did a whole video reacting to the announcement, and I will have that linked down below if you have not seen it. It has seemed like there is a lot of excitement about Han Kang as the winner, and I know there are a lot of people who are now planning to read one of her books. Most people feel like they're aiming for The Vegetarian, which makes sense. It is probably the most known book by Han Kang that has been translated into English by Deborah Smith. By the way, it was the winner of the International Booker Prize, and it was one of the New York Times top 10 books of the year in which it was released, and it just is going to be interesting to see how people react, because that book is kind of heavy and hard and kind of difficult in ways, but it is an interesting book, and I've thought about it a lot in the years since I read it, so I will be very interested in hearing what people think when they finally get around to reading Han Kang as a result of the Nobel Prize for Literature. On the topic of the Nobel, I think one thing I've seen in the comments, which I haven't been able to really successfully keep up with, is a notion of, you do see some of the names that are commonly thrown about for the Nobel Prize mentioned. Like, I know somebody mentioned Margaret Atwood, and I haven't really seen Haruki Murakami on the comments on the video, but I have seen, not so much Haruki Murakami this time around, actually, but I have seen Margaret Atwood and Salman Rushdie in particular bandied about. And it is always really interesting because every year, I think it's Ladbrokes will put together like a list of odds for the Nobel Prize for Literature, and it's pretty much always wrong. The number one contender, I don't think, has ever been the actual winner of the prize in any of the years in which I have paid attention. I didn't even look at the list this year because it kind of starts to feel like a waste of time. That's actually not true. I did look at the list last night after the prize had been announced because I was curious if Han Kang even appeared, and she was way, way, way down the list with like 33/1 odds. I don't know how odds work, but she was very low down the list. And I will say, I think last year, Yun Fusei was close to the top. He was in second or third place in the betting odds, and then he ended up winning. And that's probably the best that has happened. And the names that are thrown about every year most often are Haruki Murakami, Salman Rushdie, and now Margaret Atwood is sort of in that conversation as well. And I always find it interesting because I feel like at this point, it's very unlikely that any one of the three of them are going to win. Because, being honest about it, Haruki Murakami has been in the conversation for a Nobel Prize for Literature for about 10 to 15 years at this point. The case has already been made. It's there if the Swedish Academy ever decides to pick it up, and they just haven't. So with every year, it starts to feel more and more unlikely that it's going to happen because, again, the case has already been made and they just haven't responded to it. Maybe they will in the future. This could be one of those things where the more people apply pressure saying that this is what we want to see happen, maybe they will. I mean, it worked for Bob Dylan because Bob Dylan actually consistently appeared in the top 10 before he ultimately won the Nobel Prize for Literature, which was a big departure for them in recognizing a singer-songwriter. And we don't have to quibble about whether or not that was an appropriate decision. You know, I think it's a very different approach to defining the prize. So there's room to allow for it, but it is a very different way of defining what should be recognized by the Nobel Prize for Literature. I don't think there's really any denying that. Really, it just comes down to whether or not you agree with that definition. And the same as Haruki Murakami is basically true for Salman Rushdie, except the time period is longer. The case for Salman Rushdie has been around for 20 to 30 years at this point, and they haven't done it. A lot of people really expected him to get a Nobel Prize for Literature after the horrific stabbing attack that was made on him, that he now wrote a memoir about, that is one of the most popular, critically recognized books of this year. The case has been out there. It's still possible because a lot of people still want it, but they haven't responded to the case that has been made. And Margaret Atwood, again, the case has been out there almost as long as Salman Rushdie. And I'd say it has intensified in recent years because of the Trump administration and how prescient that really made The Handmaid's Tale seem. And, of course, The Handmaid's Tale TV adaptation and the sequel that she released for The Handmaid's Tale called The Testaments, which co-won the Booker Prize. It's interesting because I feel like we've latched onto these names and it feels to me like it's unlikely that they will ever win at this point, but maybe they will. It's just one of the interesting things to talk about when it comes to the Nobel Prize for Literature. The other things to talk about is I saw the Northern Lights for the first time last night. That was just something that was really cool. It's not book related at all, just really cool. Now, when I say that, we saw kind of ghostly shapes and beams kind of in the sky shifting around, and that was really cool. But I had never seen it before in any form or function. So it was just nice to see. But we didn't get the spectacular colors or the really bold vision of these lights and shapes in the sky. You know, there wasn't like the greens and the purples. Sometimes it looked like it was kind of trying to be green, but I'm just really excited. And we got Teddy out there with us. Teddy, who just came in and fell asleep on the floor right there. So he is here napping alongside me as I do my Friday reads and try to figure out how I had the camera before. So that was just a fun thing. And we watched like half of Heartstopper's new season in one night because if you know the storyline based on this current season from the books, you know why it kind of felt imperative to get through those first 4 episodes. It's such a good show. And we've been enjoying it. And anyway, if you haven't read Heartstopper, they are a very good series of graphic novels for YA. They're geared toward YA, but I am well past YA, and I have enjoyed them as well. And the other things, just a reminder to vote, because we are less than a month away from the election, and early voting has begun in a lot of states, including the state where I live, Montana. And of course, as part of this, I had to wear my Vote to Protect Democracy t-shirt. People always ask where I got this. I got it at Shop at Matter in Denver, Colorado. I don't think they have repeated this design, but I will include a link to their store down below. And, you know, it's just so urgent to make sure you are registered to vote if you are eligible and that you vote, because so much is on the line. I've tried not to talk about it too much in recent videos because in July and into August, I did spend a lot of time talking about it, and, you know, I figured I would give it a little bit of a break. But now is an important time to bring it back up because, as I said, early voting has begun, and it is just so important that we keep this momentum going and people show up and vote, because the outcomes of this election could be very scary. It's really important, and not just for president. Show up and vote all the way down the line, because the Senate races, very important. Montana has a big governor race and a big Senate race, actually. If the Democratic candidate loses for the Senate race, it could flip the control of the Senate, and that's scary. So that's an important race. Governor, really big, because the governor we have in Montana right now has tried to enact legislation to ban books, to limit women's abilities to make decisions about their own healthcare, and to criminalize the LGBTQ plus community. So it, again, really important. And you have to pay attention all the way down to if there are judicial nominees or anything like that, because in Montana, there are 2 who have been funded by, say, anti-abortion groups. So it's really important to educate yourself about all of the candidates that are running and all of the races and make informed decisions about them. But most important, vote, 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 vote in every category that's available to you, because it matters so much. And if it doesn't matter to you, I guarantee you it matters to somebody you know. So vote to protect democracy, because democracy is on the line this year. The only other thing I want to talk about before we get into the actual Friday Reads portion of the video is the Giller Prize. I had mentioned this prize when the long list was announced. I covered it in a Friday Reads video. I'll link the Friday Reads where I talked about the whole long list in the description box down below. And I kind of threw out the idea that maybe this is a prize that I would follow. This is a very controversial year for the Giller Prize, and I will link an article down below that details what the controversy is and all of that stuff, because I don't really want to spend a lot of time getting into it, especially in a Friday Reads video. But there has been pushback about the sponsor of the prize, and a lot of authors withdrew themselves from contention from the prize. It's a whole thing, and for that reason it felt like this would not be a great year to like spotlight the Giller Prize in individual videos. And also, it wasn't exactly clear from the response how many people might be interested in Giller Prize content, but also just happened to be a busy week anyway. So I figure we'll talk about the shortlist here in this Friday Reads video, and we will look at the 5 books briefly that are up for contention. 3 of these I remember being interested in when the long list was announced, and I have not taken steps to get them. One of them is somewhat controversial. We'll get to it. So the first finalist is What I Know About You by Eric Shakur. Here's what they say about it. One man's love for another breaches the norms of gender, society, and class in the otherwise modernizing secular Egypt of Abdel Nasser and Anwar Sadat. Tarek, a doctor, nurtures a love that comes to him unexpectedly, and neither his country nor his family is able to accept. Elegantly told and profoundly affecting, What I Know About You speaks to the inherited moral structures constraining us and to the alienation of a man's inner life rendered external. Tarek leaves Cairo and his marriage for Montreal, a cold and foreign city in which his otherness is more of an ordinary kind. When circumstances finally permit, returns to confront the past and its consequences nebulously in pursuit of him. Here is a quiet, touching story in which the acts of yearning, stymied hearts transcend their troubled genesis and move their hosts toward the possibility of redemption that is love's essence. This is one of the books that had really stood out to me from the long list, and I'm glad that I'm looking at the short list and it's reminding me that this is something that had sounded really interesting to me. Of course, I'm really interested in a book that breaches the norms of gender, society, and class, and which deals with queerness. That is like catnip for me, and especially coming from a culture that I don't know too much about, which is Egyptian society, and it just sounds like something that I would be interested in experiencing. By the way, there will be links to these books and all of the books that I talk about in the description box down below. Those are affiliate links. If you follow them, you can get more information about the book from bookshop.org. You can purchase them from there. You can go to your local independent bookstore, like maybe Shop at Matter in Denver, or you could go to your library. You know, you have a lot of options depending on whether or not you like to purchase books, whether or not you can purchase books, and all of that stuff. So the next one is Curiosities. It is by Fleming. That one is actually not available on Bookshop. I don't think it has been released in the US yet. It might be like a Canada exclusive at this point. Doesn't mean you can't find it, but here is the jury citation. Anne Fleming's Curiosities begins in 17th century England, beset by the plague and rife with superstition and fear. A series of archived memoirs that the amateur historian Anne is researching provide a puzzle and the means by which this thrillingly inventive novel immerses us in the historic and illuminates the contemporary. Joan, the only one of her family to survive the sickness, takes up with another child, Thomasina, alone and nursed by a goat. They find allies where they can, notably Old Nut, an ostracized woman who is imprisoned, tried, and executed because she is thought to be a witch, as Joan is later assumed to be, before their paths, perilous and radically different, diverge. Tom, disguised as a boy, joins the crew of a ship sailing through Hudson's Bay, while Lady Margaret Long, a naturalist and thoroughly modern woman, takes Joan under wing. Singular and surprising, Curiosities is a captivating story of hope, change, and belonging, and first and foremost, a testament to varieties of love that endure beyond any one history or era. It does sound like a really interesting book. I don't think it's one of the ones that I had sort of earmarked as interesting to me. I think, if I remember correctly, this is one that I felt like I would like to get feedback from other people before really considering whether or not I would like to read it. I think I would gravitate toward 3 other books on the long list, including What I Know About You, before I would read this one, but it's ahead of the 5th option, which we will get to in a little bit. The next finalist is Prairie Edge by Connor Kerr. Here is their citation. This, by the way, is another one of the titles that had really stood out to me from the long list. Connor Kerr's Prairie Edge is both a propulsive crime narrative built around successive compounding blunders and a work of literary art that tells us about what it means to live in a world where action and rhetoric around decolonization fail to align. I mean, are you not interested yet? I am fascinated. Its 2 main characters, an idealistic would-be academic and an endearingly naive ex-con, both Metis, hatch a quixotic plan to rehome bison from national parks to downtown Edmonton, where they once ran free, as a bold statement against the settler status quo. Kerr extracts maximum amounts of comedy and pathos from the novel's premise while populating this fictional world with resonant characters whose difficult experiences with group homes, social services, and activist circles are softened by enduring family bonds and friendships. Kerr entertains us with a contemporary caper while inviting readers to consider a future that has reckoned with the past. I think this is the one that I would be most interested in reading and seeking out. So I think what I'm probably going to do is see if my library has it available, and if they don't, I might request that they purchase a copy and see how that goes. The next one is Held by Anne Michaels. The reason I think this one is probably the most controversial inclusion is that Held has been an extremely cilantro book on the Booker long list. Cilantro meaning people either love it or hate it. There's not too much in between. I haven't even seen a whole lot of people love Held, being honest. It feels like there are people who maybe admire what it's doing, but don't quite go along with the ride. But anyway, here is their citation for it. Anne Michaels' Held is a novel that floats, a beguiling association of memories, projections, and haunted instances through which the very notion of our mortality, of our resilience and desires, is interrogated in passages as impactful as they can be hypnotic. Ostensibly, Held begins with a man, John, lying injured on a First World War battlefield, who returns, broken, to the woman he loves and his Yorkshire photography studio, where ghostly figures emerge from the shadows of the photographs he develops, the sorts of images that can, like certain rhythms, dismantle us. In a story of querulous fragments refuting a novel's usual form, Michaels conveys war's legacy of harm and trauma reverberating across generations, but through them all our irrefutable connectedness. Michaels' mastery of word and situations is understated but insistent, an altogether successful reliance that deflects attention from its author and embeds the reader in the resoundingly mysterious and ephemeral. Here is a novel in which we are willingly held. And I think you can see there probably why it is so cilantro in nature, because it's playing with elements of what is expected in a novel, with the form of a novel, possibly a little bit experimental in nature. People either respond to that or they don't. And it seems that the jury for the Booker Prize did respond to it, but a lot of readers have not as well. And clearly the jury for the Giller Prize agrees with the Booker jury. They responded to it quite well. And when I said that there was one book that I would probably be the least likely to read on this list, it is actually Held by Anne Michaels. I was also really interested in Peacocks of Instagram by Deepa Rajagopalan, which is the final finalist for the Giller Prize this year. Here is the citation. An utterly absorbing, often hilarious story collection, Deepa Rajagopalan's Peacocks of Instagram reimagines the literature of the Indian diaspora in the age of globetrotting IT workers, climate change, and social media influencers. A divorced woman channels her grief over the demise of her marriage into a best-selling line of ceramics. A factory owner in Johannesburg learns about the secret life led by his sometimes girlfriend in Toronto at her funeral. A young woman takes revenge on her oil lobbyist foster dad. Written in mature, perfectly rounded prose embroidered with telling detail and pithy dialogue, the loosely linked stories of this arresting debut collection follow an array of appealing characters who not only withstand heartbreak and misunderstanding, but occasionally triumph over it by dint of their wit and cunning. In their discovery of themselves and their capabilities, Rajagopalan's stories continually surprise. And those are the contenders for the Giller Prize. I'd love to hear which one you are most interested in, what you think might win, what you think of the Giller and the controversy around it this year. Let me know all of that in the comment section down below. And with that, let's jump to the actual Friday Reads portion of this video. My reading this week was kind of all over the place. It was a bit of like an anxious week, lots going on, and I had a bit of a focus problem, and I didn't even start a new audiobook until halfway through the week. So we'll talk about the audiobook in a second. Let's talk about the print book that I read, because it is the only book that I actually finished this week, and that is Catalina, a novel by Carla Cornejo Villavicencio. This had been longlisted for the National Book Award, but did not make it onto the shortlist. I'll put my reaction to the shortlist of the National Book Award down below. And this is one of the books from the long list that had jumped out to me the hardest. It sounded very interesting to me. It also has a truly gorgeous cover that I'm trying to hold at an angle, because the danger of the library copy is that it has this very reflective plastic over it. So if I hold it wrong, it's just glare all over the cover of the book, and it's so pretty. So this is what I describe as an early adulthood novel. It's not necessarily coming of age, because I think when you hear coming of age, you think about someone transitioning from childhood into young adulthood, into adulthood. Like basically, you tend to think of someone a little bit younger than this. This is about someone who is now in the point where they are a legal adult, adjusting to the realities of being responsible for themselves as an adult and figuring out what they want to be in the world and what kind of person they want to be, essentially. And it is told through the lens of an undocumented woman named Catalina. Go figure. She is from Ecuador. She was born there, and when she was 5, she was sent to live with her grandparents, who are also undocumented, living in Queens in New York City. Her parents had died in an accident when she was very young, like 1 or 2 years old, and it's sort of a miracle that she escaped unharmed while her parents were killed. So initially she was raised by her aunt and uncle in Ecuador, and then it was decided that she would be sent to live with her grandmother and grandfather in Queens. And she has been sort of floating along. She is dealing with a bit of the trauma and the grief of not really knowing her parents, and then subsequently losing her aunt and uncle, who she knew as parents. So the way she describes it is that she essentially has 3 sets of parents in her life so far, and she doesn't really know how to assign roles to any of them anymore, because as an undocumented person, she cannot leave Queens. She can't go back to Ecuador, which means she cannot see her aunt and uncle, who are the people she most readily identifies as a mother and father, because they were the ones doing the job when she became old enough to remember. So she grew up there, and in the way of many immigrant children in this country, she was pushed to succeed and to do well. She performed well academically. She managed to get into Harvard, but now she's coming to the end of her time at Harvard. And through the DREAM Act, she was able to attend Harvard as an undocumented person. She's very reluctant to share the information about her status as a documented, or undocumented rather, citizen with people, because she's afraid of how they will judge her, what it could mean for her, what it could mean for her grandparents, and what will happen if people are given access to this knowledge. And she's also facing the reality that when she graduates, she doesn't have a lot of job opportunities, because even when she does an internship and they're potentially interested in hiring her, she's undocumented. So she doesn't necessarily have the paperwork to actually work for these people. She can perform an internship where she's not earning compensation, but she doesn't necessarily have a future. And that's frustrating for her, because she's surrounded by all of these people in Harvard who are very excited about what their next steps are going to be and planning for the future. And she doesn't have a right to do that, in her own opinion. I think this book could be very frustrating to a certain set of readers, because Catalina engages in some very self-destructive behavior. She engages in some behavior that feels inexplicable, especially if you have never experienced grief, self-destruction, or things like that. I think if you have read the book Real Life by Brandon Taylor and liked it, try Catalina. If you have read the book Luster by Raven Leilani and liked it, try Catalina. If you read those books and were extremely frustrated by the characters and their choices, Catalina probably won't be a book for you. I mean, there's a chance, because The difference is this one is told again through the lens of an undocumented citizen who is sort of tenuously holding on to status in this country through the DREAM Act, which at the time that this book is set is being argued and pushed back, and it has not become like a real thing. And she is too afraid to really hope that it could become a real thing that will give her a path to citizenship in the United States. It is a very interesting early adulthood tale. I would also say if you are someone who read Sarah Tenka Matthews' book, All This Could Be Different, which had also been longlisted, I think was actually shortlisted for the National Book Award a couple of years ago, and you enjoyed it, this might be a good book for you. And what's interesting about a lot of these sort of early adulthood books, as I define them, is that a lot of them have this sort of sensibility of struggling to meet the moment where you are an adult in charge of your own destiny now, or at least your own life, and being able to make decisions for yourself and feeling almost completely paralyzed. And real life looks at the paralysis through the lens of racism, because the character in that book experiences a lot of racist actions and microaggressions as well. And that happens to Catalina as well. And the same thing is true of Luster by Raven Leilani. So they are fascinating reads, but I think they won't be for everyone. I was very interested in this book. I wouldn't say I loved it, but I did really appreciate its perspective and the things that it made me think about. And the story of Catalina is fascinating and urgent. And what's funny as well is that the description of the book really focuses on a relationship that she gets into in her final year at Harvard, someone who is an anthropologist. And the way the jacket describes that relationship makes it sound that because he's someone who studies South America and studies Ecuador in particular, that it makes her examine her relationship to her home country. And that's not necessarily true. I mean, it kind of does. But that character, to me, is mostly treated as almost like a colonizing force, because he's a white man, a privileged man, who is sort of inserting himself into South Americans' cultures that he doesn't necessarily understand, which is fascinating, by the way. And he is becoming an expert over someone like Catalina, who has a connection to it, but there's a tricky layer in that as well, where technically she is the expert. She grew up there. She understands this culture in ways that he cannot. But she also has an extreme emotional disconnect from that culture because she knows she can't go back and visit or anything like that. So there are multiple layers of Catalina that are really interesting. Your mileage is going to vary. I found this book to be very interesting and intriguing, and I'm glad that I read it. I wouldn't say I love it, but I think it's definitely a worthwhile reading experience because it did teach me a lot. It kind of opened my eyes in certain areas, and I think it's a great way of capturing a story that is still very urgent, even in the years after this book is set, because of just, let me gesture broadly at the world and the political situation in this country right now. And again, mention that you should vote to protect democracy. So before we get into the next print book that I started, let's talk about the audio that I did this week. And it took me a long time to pick an audio. I don't really know why, but I think maybe it's just an anxiety thing. I feel like I have been listening to podcasts when I have time to listen to something more than I have been listening to audiobooks. Ultimately, I think on Wednesday, I finally started a new audiobook, and I didn't want to decide what my new audiobook was going to be until I was ready to start. So I chose Long Island Compromise by Taffy Brodesser-Akner. She had been a contender for the National Book Award for her book Fleischman is in Trouble a couple of years ago, which was adapted into a TV series for Hulu in the United States. And I had a big resistance to reading that book, even when it was on its run for the National Book Award. And a couple of people told me that I should give it a try. And I've just been very resistant to the idea of it because I'm not convinced I would like it. I have a very strong aversion to novels about white men who can't get their act together, which is really funny for me to talk about, given that I just talked about enjoying and finding a novel about a early 20s Ecuadorian woman who can't get her life together. But it's different. The level of privilege between that and stories about, white men who can't get their life together is it's just very different. And I really struggle with those. Now, from what I've heard, Fleischman in Trouble is a book that sort of subverts your expectation for that kind of story in the end, but leading up to the end, it's just basically that. And I think it sounds interesting. I haven't wanted to do it. I think I decided I would use Long Island Compromise as a sort of test case. And if I really liked it, then I would go back and do Fleischman is in Trouble. And I've been struggling. So on Wednesday, I made it, I think, about 22% into the audio, maybe 25% into the audio. And it was difficult for me. Well, okay, let's be fair. The first section of the book is fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. I was like hooked on that section. So this is a story of a family, the Fletcher family, on Long Island. Go figure. By the way, I am originally from Long Island. So these are like my people, which is kind of fun to read about. Although I guess I just complained about reading books about white men who can't get their life together. And, that is my people as well. But anyway, the Fletcher family in the early 1980s, they were doing really well. They had a lot of money. They had were building a sort of legacy as a well-known, wealthy family on Long Island, especially within the Jewish community. And in the early 1980s, something bad happens to them. The father, Carl, is kidnapped from the driveway and he is held for ransom. And that is the story that is told in the first part, the story of his kidnapping and the sort of interruption that it has on the family and the difficult days and the stressful days of waiting to find out if he was alive, if he would be returned to them, and the mother sort of going on this journey to deliver the ransom, and a little bit about the two young children. The mother had been pregnant at the time of this kidnapping. And so the first part, fascinating. The second part immediately jumps closer to the present, where one of the sons, whose name is Bernard, you know him as Bernard in the first section, but now he has come to be known as Beamer, takes over the narrative, and I hate him. You're supposed to hate him. But he is the definition of what I struggle with in this type of story, which is he's just a white man who's getting in his own way and can't get his life together. And there are systemic things, like he has anxiety and trauma from this incident that his family has pretty steadfastly refused to talk about in the 40 years since it happened, or near 40 years since it happened. And ultimately, I believe it's going to be about the impact on each of the family members in turn, including the daughter who was born after all the events were over. The problem is I just had such a difficult time getting through Beamer's section. So as I said, on Wednesday, I pushed myself to get to the end of that section. And I'm really hoping that the next part of the book will transition to a different character. I haven't listened to it to know that it does, because I had such a hard time pushing my way through Beamer's section of the book that I have not picked this audiobook up since Wednesday. I'm filming this on Friday. So 2 days later, I have not touched the audio of Long Island Compromise. And part of me is thinking maybe I should just let this go. Let it be a DNF. But I really want to give it a chance. Like, if the perspective shifts to another character, maybe that'll be interesting. Maybe it'll help me, and maybe it will resolve in a way that will make this feel worthwhile. But I just feel like Beamer is a nope for me, like a hard pass. And it's made it very difficult. There are some aspects of the book that are incredibly clever. Again, that first section of the book, you could separate that out and make it like a short story, and it would be great. But there are also times, especially once you get into the Beamer section, that feel like it's trying very hard. And that also makes it a little bit difficult. And I feel like I need to wait until I'm in a different section of the book to really make a decision about what's happening and what I'm going to do about this book. So it's been a very rocky experience so far, but I am going to try to keep going, and we'll see how that goes. Stay tuned. So it's going to be a journey for my audiobook, and we'll see what happens with it. The next print book that I picked up, so I finished Catalina, I think on Wednesday as well, and then yesterday I started The Burrow. by Melanie Chang. This is not The Bunny by Mona Awad. This is The Burrow by Melanie Chang, which is not actually published yet. So if you follow the link for this book in the affiliate links down below, this would be a pre-order, but it's coming out soon. It will be released on November 12th, 2024. So we're a month away from its release date. And this is coming from Tin House. I am like a Tin House fanboy. And it sounded really interesting to me. So this is a novella. It's less than 200 pages. Let's just, for the sake of it, find out how many pages it is. It's 187 pages. And I really enjoyed Shorty September. So part of me is thinking, like, maybe let's keep that going a little bit. This is the story of a grieving family told in the early-ish days of the pandemic. Like, at this point, there are still a lot of restrictions on being out and about in the community. Basically, you have a husband and wife who have lost their infant child. So trigger warnings galore. If grief is difficult for you, maybe this isn't a good book for you. If dead babies is difficult for you, maybe this is not a good book for you. And in their grief journey, their older child, who is obviously still alive, wants a bunny, and they decide to get her one. And after that, it sounds like the grandmother moves in with them, or at least comes to visit, and it sort of forces them to confront their grief. So it's going to be really interesting. I'm only about 20 pages in. Actually less. I am 14 pages in, and it has been very interesting so far, but I'm only at the point of the book where the father has just the bunny has just been introduced to the house, and it'll be interesting to see where it goes from there. And I am someone who has sort of struggled with grief books recently because I've been on my own grief journey. We don't have to get into it here. And over the last 2-3 years, I think I'm at a point where I'm hopefully healing. So I think this is a book that I am at a point where I can take in. And so far it's been really interesting, but it will be interesting as well to see where it goes ultimately. So that is The Burrow, and I should be done with it by the next time we speak, because again, it's a short book. The only reason I didn't get further in it yesterday is that we stayed out looking at the Northern Lights pretty late last night. So the time that I would have sat with this before bed ended up being time that we were out looking at these sort of Northern Lights. And when I say the Northern Lights, I mean like the ghostly version of the Northern Lights that we were able to see where I live last night. So hopefully today I will start making a little bit more progress. Once I'm done with it, I don't really know what my next book will be. I want to get into the new book by Alan Hollinghurst. I've been thinking about doing something a little spooky, and I actually thought of another short book that would be really interesting to read. So I don't know what I will do when I'm done with The Burrow. I have some ideas, but that has been my reading week. I'd love to hear what you've been up to, what you've been reading, watching, loving. Are you into Heartstopper? Are you going to watch the new episode of Bake Off? Let me know all of this stuff in the comment section down below. As always, I really appreciate your time. Remember to vote. Make sure you're registered. There's a link down below. And until next time, happy reading.